The Money Show.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
The Personal Finance feature. Warren Ingram, as you know, is the financial advisor and co-founder of Galileo Capital. And our subject tonight, Warren, is the retirement lessons you can't afford to ignore. Warren, and in a way, this really encapsulates a good moment to sort of encapsulate all the things that we've been learning about personal finance for so long and what the point of it really is.
Absolutely right, Stephen. And I think it's a good time to chat about it because the world is crazy right now. And I think a lot of people are unsettled about their investments. And for those of us that are still working and contributing to our savings and our investments, it's very unsettling. But for people who are retired, that discontent goes up a lot because you're watching your investments go down at a time when you need to draw from them. So I think it's a very good time to chat about this.
Okay, so the issue really is longevity, how long you actually live for. And this really is about how you make sure that when the time finally comes, not to retire, the other worst time, that things are ready for that. So this is about how much money you have and where you are in your retirement at that point. In other words, it's not about the first year of retirement.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think when you talk to people and you say to someone at age 50 or 55 that we should probably plan for your life to run out at somewhere around age 100, usually they sort of smile at you as if you're a little bit crazy and your head's in the clouds. But it is a reality that there are lots of people all around the world and in South Africa that comfortably live to their late 80s, early 90s. And if you're hitting retirement at 65 and thinking, well, I've probably got 10 or 15 years of life left, and unfortunately, you're likely to be wrong. And the worst thing that could happen in a situation like that is that you spend aggressively in the early part of your retirement and not worry too much about later in life, and then your money runs out at a time when you can't really do anything about it. So I just want to say for a lot of people, just go and Google longevity in South Africa. Go and especially if you do have access to private healthcare, I think longevity is somewhere around age 88. For a lot of people, and so you've got to make sure that you've done your planning correctly. And as you say, it's not about year 1; it's about year 20 and 25 of your retirement.
So, when people are planning for retirement now, what are they planning for? What length of time are they planning for? I mean, they're not planning for 10 years, obviously, and I think very few of us would retire and think, well, I'm going to plan for 40.
I think the average retirement plan sort of says 20 or 25 years of retirement, and I think that's wrong. I think we should be planning for at least 35 years of retirement, and if you consider that we might start work at 20 or 23, let's say, and you might work for 30 or 35 years, that means your retired life could be as long as your working life. And the trick around this is, you only have that working time to build up all the money you need to look after yourself later in life. So it is a real concern, this longevity. I mean, it's a real benefit. I'm not, it's great that science is helping us live better and live longer. But planning wise, we should be saying to ourselves, is there any way I can work from age 65 to 70 so that I work that extra time and I don't have to provide for the income for that sort of time? So almost it's a double benefit. If you can work an extra 5 years, it's 5 years of saving, but it's also 5 years that you don't have to fund with your savings. So it's a real thing. This I think we should be working longer and planning that we're going to get to the end of life at somewhere around age 100 for most of us.
It's the last 10 years when you have the real problem. If you haven't planned for that last 10 years, and also I suppose your costs are going up too in some ways.
Yeah, I think there's this misnomer that life gets cheaper as you get older, and and I think that's not true. I think healthcare costs become a much bigger part of life as you get into your late 70s and early 80s. And it doesn't matter if you've got a very good medical aid. There's still going to be costs that you are going to incur that you have to pay out of pocket. And so, early in your retired life, you can always make a change that can help you later. In other words, you can, get a part-time gig, doing some work, or you can reduce your expenses and make a big impact on your retired life later. But if you realize only, at age 78 that actually your money's going to run out at age 85, so suddenly you don't have a lot of scope to make changes. So that last 10 years, you're quite right, Stephen. I think it's, if you haven't got your planning right, that last 10 years becomes a desperate situation and not many things you can do to address the problem.
So once you've retired, say you retire at 65 or 70, right? How can you make sure that your money is working as hard in that period than it was before? Because you need to draw into it. I suppose, though, it should be at the peak that it will ever be, so you have more money invested, so there should be a higher return, but you are beginning to draw down on it.
Look at you. That's a fantastic point. And it's the one that the big sort of pension funds and retirement fund managers don't always get around people at the early stage of retirement. Is if you're planning that you're going to live off your investments for 35 years, that by any definition is called the very long term. And that means you should have a very high exposure to growth assets like shares and property companies and the like. And a lot of the time, people get advised to hit retirement with very conservative portfolios where they get told, you can't afford to take losses. You need to protect what you've got. And I understand the emotion side of that, but the truth is that the cost of living is your biggest enemy during retirement. It's not markets going up or down. Markets do that all the time, and they've done it for centuries, and I'm sure they'll do it for the next few centuries. So the one reality is that your cost of living will go up every single year. And if you don't have enough exposure to growth assets to give you the growth ahead of the cost of living escalations, then you're going to find yourself in a position where you might have more money in rand terms, but the buying power of that money is absolutely eroded. And so I think that's the thing that people get wrong at retirement, is they think, I need to scale down my investment objectives and be conservative and cautious with my money. And I think it's a big mistake. I'm also not saying that this is the time to roll the dice as if you're in a casino and you take ridiculous risk. That's no good either, because you can't afford to recover from catastrophic losses. But you should be responsible and objective with your money. And I think somewhere around 65 to 75% of your investment should be in growth assets. It certainly shouldn't be below 50%. I think that's almost recklessly conservative, if there's a phrase like that.
Lifestyle costs as you retire. Now, I still just think of how much money children cost, but after that, you kind of think, well, actually, as I get older, I will spend less money. I won't be quite as expensive to myself. And therefore, my lifestyle costs will go down once I've stopped working. Does it work like that?
I think that's almost hogwash. In truth, sometimes I see financial planners talking about something called a replacement ratio, where they'll say, if you were earning 100,000, before retirement, you can work on a replacement ratio of 75%. In other words, instead of spending 100,000, you're now going to spend only 75,000, and I just don't think that that's true at all. My experience is that when people are in the very early stages of their retirement, they are generally in very good health. They've got time, they've got energy, and now they've got motivation to go and do all the things that they didn't have the time to do when they were working. And so that means, potentially, more travel and maybe, more entertainment and eating out, things that you couldn't get to when you had to go to work, early on a Monday. And so in my experience, you could actually find that you end up spending a little bit more than you did as a working person in the first few years of your retirement. And then the other thing we get told is that late in life, when you're 78 or 80, you're probably not traveling very much. You probably don't eat out as much, and you're a bit more homebound. That certainly seems to be the case. However, the medical costs that we chatted about earlier do become a much bigger factor. And so I think when we plan for our retirement, we should be saying that, what you were spending in the last few years of retirement, you should maintain that as your projection going forward. So the only thing that I would take out of my projected lifestyle costs would be something like university education costs for children, or perhaps you had your last couple of bond repayments and that's not going to repeat. But other than that, all of the lifestyle costs that you had before, I would maintain them because I think the mix of your costs might change. But absolutely, you are going to spend what you spent in your pre-retired life.
We're talking to Warren Ingram this evening on personal finance, the retirement lessons you can't afford to ignore. Your questions for Warren, 011 883 0702 021 446 0567, and of course voice notes on 072 702 1702. The other thing, Warren, is that we have a certain amount of money, and you might think, well, over the last 10 years, my investment trajectory has been going up, and this is what I ended up with. And if I even out inflation over the next 30 years, it will be that. But I imagine there could also be something that happens to those investments. And a really good example is what's happened to the JSE since the start of Donald Trump's Iranian adventure.
Absolutely, and the scary thing for retired people when you see big market moves like we've had now is that you're drawing money from your investments every month, and it sounds like an obvious point, but the practice is that let's say you've got, just to keep the numbers simple, you've got a 10 million rand portfolio, and every single month you might be selling a few units of your unit trust to fund your income. And if your 10 million rand portfolio drops by 15%, then you find yourself in a position where you've got an 8.5 million rand portfolio, but you're still drawing the same amount of rands every month. And so, if you started the year, let's say drawing 5%, you might find that halfway through the year, you're now drawing 7 or 8%, if there's a very big market drop. And the balancing act you've got to strike here is it's good, and it's part of the plan that you are going to draw from your investments. But now you've got this problem of drawing from investments after they've taken a big knock, and you're drawing a bigger percentage. Just simply the maths works out like that. And so your capital might not get the chance to recover. And so that's where we find this thing. It's called sequence risk. It's about when you draw the money out of your investments and at what point do you do that. And if people don't get that planning right for planning for these big market drops during their retired lives, it can have quite a big detrimental impact on their investments over the 30 or 35 years that we're talking about.
So it would make sense to plan. So you might have, and you've told us before about having I think it's the retirement number. In other words, what is the number at which you feel you can retire? You actually need to have more than that to take into account for this. So yes, there might be an upside. Growth can surprise too, as we've seen last year. But you actually have to prepare the other way. You have to have more than you think you're going to need.
I think your retirement number is probably an accurate number, but what you should maybe do is work on the mix of your assets and just be very careful around how you mix those assets together so that you can draw the right income from the right assets. So just to give you a very practical example, in the first couple of years of retirement, maybe you run with a slightly bigger cash balance than is ideal, and so your emergency fund is maybe a little bit bigger than we've been speaking about. I would always tell people take 3 to 6 months in your emergency fund, but perhaps when you hit retirement that you make that bigger. So you might say, actually, let me have 1 year's worth of expenses in an emergency fund, and perhaps I'll run with a little bit more in bonds and maybe even in my portfolios a little bit of extra cash. So your asset mix looks a little bit different to the norm in that early stage of retirement. And the reason for that is if you do start retired life, and let's say that was, January was the beginning of your retired life, and you were feeling really good about your portfolio because 2025 was amazing, and now you see this big drop in the JSE. If you've got a big emergency fund, you can start to use that as your income asset for a period of time, and rather not draw from your growth assets, so that you give the growth assets a bit of time to recover, because eventually this, whatever's going on with Trump and the Middle East, it will pass. Whether it passes in a week or 3 months, we don't know. But if you can have that emergency fund to get you through this big dip, once the markets see that this conflict is over and goods and oil are moving again, they're going to become optimistic, and they'll think that life is good again, which means that investment values start to recover. And then you can start to draw from your growth assets again. So I'm not sure that you have to have a bigger or a much bigger balance of retirement assets than that retirement number we've spoken about. But I do think you've got to be very careful with the mix of those assets, Stephen.
We're speaking to Warren Ingram tonight, the financial advisor and co-founder of Galileo Capital. Your questions for him, the retirement lessons you can't afford to ignore. Your thoughts as well. 072 702 1702 and your calls 021 446 0567 and 011 883 0702. We have a question from Sapiwa. Sapiwa is saying, I'm 38. I've been sending my parents 4,000 Rand a month for the last 6 years. They have no pension and no savings. My siblings do nothing. I love my parents, but I'm falling behind on my retirement savings, and I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. Nobody talks about this in our family. I don't know what to do. Sapiwa does sound quite desperate. Sapiwa, I'm sure you're speaking actually for many, many people. We'll have an answer for you from Warren in just a moment.
The Money Show. Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
Warren Ingram, as you know, is the financial advisor and co-founder of Galileo Capital, and your questions for him on 072 702 1702. Sapiwa's question, I've been sending my parents 4,000 Rand a month for the last 6 years. I'm 38. They have no pension, no savings. My siblings don't do anything. I love my parents. I'm falling behind in my retirement savings. No one talks about this. I don't know what to do. It's a very tough question, Warren, from Sapiwa there, and he's clearly in a very difficult place.
Yep, and I think you made the point that there are a lot of people in our country in some kind of a similar position to this, and I mean, it is a very difficult situation, and I don't think there's a kind of a magic solution that deals with all of the problems that this raises. So my starting point here is, towards the end of the question, is no one's talking about this in the family, and I think that is the starting point. If you're in this position, I think it's time to sit down with your siblings to say, we have a problem, and we need to look after our parents, and it can't be one of us that carries this load, and so it's a case of spreading that load in terms of thinking about this issue, discussing it, and then jointly coming up with solutions. And it's not always that there's going to be a bunch of very easy solutions to come up with. But it's interesting when you start to talk about this as a collective, how people will come up with ideas. And it could be that, that's a bit of communication, helps for the rest of the family to understand the need, and that they start to contribute. That would be the ideal. But it could be that they find other solutions, but potentially, different accommodation solutions where you can kind of have a multi-generation family on a property or something like that. But I think it does start with communication. And the difficulty here is that you can't take your own nuclear family. So let's just say that if you've got children and then harm your retirement funding as well, to the point where you're in becoming a financial burden on your children as well, where this problem just moves from one generation to the next. So I think it's very important that if you're 38 years old, and you're now addressing this, that you don't just let it carry on. I think it's correct to talk about this and to share the burden with everybody in the family and let everybody come up with the solution. But you are correct in your points of view, where you can't carry this load and then drive your own financial position into a wall, because then you are going to carry on this legacy to your children as well. And that's just not something any parent wants to do.
I often think in situations like this, and I'm no financial expert or family or psychological expert, but one of the things that happens, Warren, and you have vast experience with money, it's tempting for Sipiwe to say, I'm not going to do anything, people will be angry with me if I bring it up. If he doesn't, in the longer run, he's going to be very angry with his siblings, and that could destroy his relationship with them too.
It's interesting psychology here, because we do our best to try and help everybody, and either that means we really harm ourselves, and then that resentment builds up later in life, and or we live with this fear of what ask ourselves that question: what if I bring this up and they're upset with me? Well, what if you bring it up and they are relieved that they can help? What if you bring it up and they come up with some fantastic solutions that you didn't know about? And so I think, we shouldn't just go to the negative. And frankly, if your siblings are upset with you because you've been carrying this financial burden on their behalf, and it's now time for them to cough up as well, that's maybe their issue. You're living in fear of other people's feelings when you're trying to help everybody. I'm afraid that sometimes you just got to take the tough action, and it's not being selfish. When we might have spoken about this before, but when you get on the airplane, the airline stewards always say to you, put the oxygen mask on yourself before you help the passengers around you. And this is the exact financial equivalent of doing that. You have to look after yourself as well, so that you can be in a position to help your parents for a very long period of time. And so don't worry about what your siblings are going to say. Hope that actually that sharing the burden with them allows them to help you with some solutions.
Sure. Such an interesting point. Thank you so much. Warren Ingram, the financial advisor, co-founder of Galileo Capital. We've been talking tonight about the retirement lessons you cannot afford to ignore. This is one of those episodes of Personal Finance where I strongly urge you to find the podcast in about 20 minutes or so and send that along to anyone you think might actually need to hear it.